Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 8th of April of 2024. Today we have a lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Kharkiv direction. The Russians continue clearing the area probably before the further greatest Russian offensive operation. This is going to be probably the second Russian attempt to establish control over Kharkiv. The first one took place in 2022. In 2022 the Russians, as you know, were let's say defeated on the direction. They were forced to fall back, and now the Russians are getting ready, probably are getting ready. Today we got a lot of interesting geolocations, and probably the most important geolocation is this one. And this is a very interesting video. As you can see on the video, the Russians managed to discover another convoy, another railways and train with a significant number of fuel, with significant number of some parts, and for Ukrainian armored vehicles and so on. And the Russians were following for a long time, as I understand. This is something like reconnaissance operation, and after the Ukrainians stopped and concentrated the train with the fuel at one point, the Russians attacked the territory with very likely Tornado S system or Iskander. As a result of the strike, the entire train with fuel was destroyed. And you know that this is not energy facilities, this is not like the productions plants with production of drones or something like this. This is just fuel. But when talking about offensive operation on the border, it's very important for the Russians to be 400% sure that when they start offensive operation, the Ukrainians will not have even fuel to counterattack and to redeploy additional reinforcement, let's say from Kharkiv to the borderlands. Furthermore, we got additional reports from the area. The Ukrainians continue building fortifications. They're very fast. They're trying to be they're in a hurry. They understand that the Russians are going to start offensive. They might start offensive very soon, and as you can see, they're building fortifications. I can't tell for sure whether these fortifications will allow the Ukrainians to hold this area for a very long time, because if you want to repel attack, you should start building the fortifications probably 2 or 3 years ago, but not in the months before an offensive operation. Furthermore, we got another report from the local military administration that the mayor, the governor, let's say the head of military administration stated, and let's say he will expand the forced evacuation from the northern regions. Mainly the Ukrainians are saying about the evacuation of the area between the village by the name of Bogodukhov and Kharkiv itself. So if we, let's say, add this area on map, the Ukrainians are planning to evacuate everything that located along this along this railway. This is strategical railway between Sumy area. So this is the Sumy, the capital of the Sumy region, and Kharkiv itself. And not just over that, there is another intersection of the railways, and another road goes to Pavlograd and further to the central and the western Ukraine. So this is one of the most important logistic arteria that Ukrainians use to supply Kharkiv, and Ukrainians are planning to evacuate forces because they will try to concentrate significant number of soldiers, and they try to evacuate civilians because they understand that civilians, as soon as the Russians start offensive, will provide significant number of data, photos, video confirmation of concentration of Ukrainians, and of course the Russians would destroy this. So of course today we also got additional videos of FABs and missile strikes in Kharkiv during the daylight. The Russians are no longer waiting for night period of time. They bomb town every day, every single hour. And when talking about daily strikes, the main purpose of these strikes is to show civilians, to show people that still lives in Kharkiv that they need to evacuate and to run away from Kharkiv as soon as possible, as fast as possible. Furthermore, we got another video from Vovchansk. The Russians managed to discover a significant concentration of Ukrainian forces in the forest in the central part of the town by the name of Vovchansk. On this, let's say, image, we can see some personnel carriers, Ukrainian soldiers. And when the Russians discovered the Ukrainians, they start bombing and attacking the territory with multiple launch rocket systems like probably Grad or Uragan. Currently, we don't know for sure about the level of Ukrainian losses, but probably they were very heavy. And before we're moving further, I would like to discuss with you important topic. Once again, based on the video, today the Russians managed to discover and to destroy the train with significant number of fuel. And you know, I analyzed the data that we received during the previous 24-48 hours. During this period of time, the Russians damaged, destroyed or attacked significant number of infrastructure facilities, places with fuel and with the fuel depots. For example, in the western part of Ukraine, the Russians managed to discover and to destroy another oil storage facility in the vicinity of the town by the name of Zvahel. There were few explosions. There is a fuel depot, as you can see, very big one. We have some pictures of the damage and the fire on that fuel depot. And another strike, as we just discussed, took place in Kharkiv. Another strike took place in the western part of Ukraine. There were a few more all over the entire territory of Ukraine. And we can make a conclusion that during the previous 48-72 hours, the Russians mainly were concentrated not on the energy facilities, not on some power plants or some, let's say, production of drones facilities or something like this. The Russians were, let's say, targeting the fuel depots and ammo depots. So we understand that the fuel depots are very important, because when the Russians start offensive, they need to be 100% sure that Ukrainians don't have even possibilities to send forces to counterattack the Russians. This is very important. And furthermore, we can move back to, let's say, western part of Donetsk direction, the vicinity of Pokrovsk. For example, in the town by the name of Udachne, in this area, the Russians destroyed another warehouse in the area. Currently, we can't tell for sure what exactly was located in that warehouse. Maybe that was another fuel depot. Maybe that was like the depot with some military munition, artillery rounds or something like this. But the Russians destroyed that ammo depot or fuel depot also with the same purposes, to reduce the Ukraine possibilities in the area to the west of Avdiivka. The same story took place in Pushkina. Another ammo depot was destroyed as a result of Tornado S or Iskander strike. There was a very heavy fire, and based on this video we can make a conclusion that that was another fuel depot that Ukrainians were using to support their forces in the area of Nitailova, Donetsk, Avdiivka. Another missile strike took place in Slaviansk. Of course, when talking about Slaviansk, that was the strike not against probably fuel depot. This is the Iskander missile, as you can see. Very likely the Russians damaged and destroyed the temporary position of Ukrainian armed forces, of Ukrainian reserves that were redeployed to Slaviansk. Probably later the Ukrainians were planning to redeploy these forces further to Bogdanov, Chasov Yar, but something went wrong, and currently the Ukrainians are no longer have these reserves because they were buried under the ruins of this strike. Once again, the Russians were attacking the Ukrainian fuel and ammo depots significantly during the previous 48-72 hours. Furthermore, we got a very interesting report from the head of the main Directorate of Intelligence, Kirill Budanov. He stated that the Russians are going to start the full-scale and greatest Russian offensive operation in the end of the spring and in the beginning of the summer. So very soon. So why he stated and noted about the end of the spring and the beginning of June, why the Russians, we can say why the Russians are not going to attack, let's say, in the end of April or something like this. And the explanation is very simple. We have the third year of the special military operation, and now the April is the month of the Orthodox Easter. So the Russians will not attack before Easter, and the Russians will not attack after the Easter, because after the Easter is May holidays, the Russian Victory Day, and usually during this period of time we don't see any big activity from the Russian side, just if everything big happens. So just after the end of Easter, Orthodox Easter, and after the end of the 9th of May, the Russians will start their full-scale offensive operation. I'll remind you that the Victory Day the Russians celebrate on the 9th of May, so this exactly everything is according to Budanov's statement. So somewhere after the 15th of May, the Russians will start the preparation. Probably they're going to be massive caliber strike or massive HH-101 strikes, and after that the Russians will start offensive. And most of the sources are saying that the Russians are going to attack Kharkiv, but if you ask my opinion, today the Russians published very interesting video from Kherson direction. They published the video of the military exercises with significant number of pontoon equipment trucks, and there was was military exercises about building pontoon bridges, and this is not like at the beginning of the special military or special attack or something like this, but that was the video that published today during all these talks and rumors about the Russian full-scale greatest offensive operation. So, and if you ask my opinion, of course the Russians can start their offensive operations towards Kharkiv, but we know that Ukrainians have already redeployed significant number of forces in Kupiansk and Kharkiv, and Kharkiv is a very big city, more than 1 million population. The Russians may try to try their luck in the, let's say, classical directions like Siversk or Chasov Yar, or further to Pokrovsk from the west of Avdiivka, but pontoon bridges operation, of course, can be used just on one direction. We are talking about Kherson. I'm not saying that the Russians are going to, let's say, start the greatest, let's say, return to Kherson and Kherson itself, but if you ask my opinion, and if the Russians have such resources, let's say, to cross Dnipro River and to establish control over Kherson, the towns around Kherson, of course, this would lead to one important thing. If when talking about this direction, we know that there are lots of brigades, like marine brigades, but most of those brigades were significantly damaged during the battle for Kharkiv, so the Ukrainians don't have a well prepared defense belt in the area. And obviously, if the Russians start landing operation in Kherson, it will force the Ukrainians to redeploy a significant number of reinforcements, probably from Kharkiv direction, or to redeploy forces from Orekhov, or to redeploy forces from Siversk, and the Russians then will have significant chances to attack on one of these directions with the purpose to completely break through the Ukraine defense belt and to capture significant territories. So for now, I'm just trying to tell you that nobody knows for 100%, just Putin maybe and Shoigu, where exactly the Russians are going to start their greatest summer offensive operation. This might be Kharkiv, this might be Kherson, Orekhov, Avdiivka, Siversk, Kupiansk, and many other towns and cities and settlements all over the entire Ukraine, even including Kiev. Now let's move to the situation on the ground, because we have a lot of very interesting updates. And first, let's start with the southern Kupiansk direction. We haven't received anything, let's say, no geolocations, but one important statement. According to information we have, the Russians managed to destroy the dam between the village of Yampolovka and the village of Myrne. So this dam was destroyed. Very likely the Ukrainians were using this dam to supply and support their forces on this side of Zherebets River in Yampolovka and itself. If you remember, the Russians during the previous few months were trying to establish control and to break through the Ukraine defense belt for significant number of times. Most of the attacks were repelled. So now, as you can see, the Russians tried to improve their positions and to reduce the Ukraine logistic, basically to cut the Ukrainians on this side of Zherebets and to get some benefits, get some superiority, and to establish final control and to break through the area. Furthermore, I'll remind you that if we increase the numbers of data, let's say from the 1st of March, then I'll remind you that on the 10th of March, the Russians reported that they destroyed another dam, but not between Yampolovka and Myrne, but between Terny and the village by the name of Kolodezi. So for now, according to these statements, according to these two reports, we can make a conclusion that Ukrainians since the beginning of March have already lost two logistic roads that connected the left and the right banks, left and the right sides of Zherebets River. Two dams were destroyed, and very likely this will cause significant problems for the Ukrainians, maybe not today, but in a week or two, when the supply and munition on the area will get less and less from on the side of armed forces of Ukraine. So anyway, this confirms further Russian plans and attempts to attack on this direction. Now we are moving to Siversk area. We have lots of updates about further Russian progress. We haven't received anything in comparison with the previous video. The Russians continue advancing on the eastern, let's say, base of the landfill. The Russians continue advancing on the southwestern, southern and southwestern side of the landfill towards Bilogorovka. We have some progress, some updates from the Russian side. The Russians continue bombing Bilogorovka itself, trying to pin the Ukrainians down and not to allow them to redeploy forces from Bilogorovka towards the landfill. And today we got a very interesting video of how the Russian FPV drone was flying above the area between Serebryanka and Georgievka, and as a result of FPV drone strikes, the Russians tried to clear the trenches on, let's say, that goes along the Seversky Donetsk River. This is a very important video. First of all, this is the first video when the Russians sent FPV drone or Baba Yaga drone so deep inside of a controlled territory of armed forces of Ukraine. Another thing, that usually when you use Baba Yaga or FPV drones, that means that you're planning to start clearing this area. I'm not telling anything, but this clearing operation tell us that maybe the Russians also wants to cross Seversky Donetsk River and to attack the Ukrainians from the north, somewhere in the vicinity of Grigorovka. Currently, I can't tell you anything, but obviously the Russians will complete the Belogorovka battle. The question is the price the Russians are going to pay for this and the time they're going to waste on this. Furthermore, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians were bombing and attacking Seversk with artillery, destroyed significant number of warehouses, ammo depots, so everything as usual. The Russians continue preparation, the foothold for the greatest rush from their side, but for now the Ukrainians hold their positions. Nothing's happened on the southern flank, on Razdolovka, Fedorovka, Vyemka. And now we're moving to Bogdanovka, Chasov Yar direction. I believe you are already familiar with reports that we received during the day from the direction. We have a lot of geolocations, videos. Some mappers are saying one thing, other mappers are saying different things. The only thing we know for sure that the Russians did manage to enter Bogdanovka, and we have geolocation of that. This is a very big video, not very big video, just 2 minutes 30-second video, and this video has different scenes from different directions, not just from Bogdanovka. And at some point of the video, like this one, we can see Bogdanovka, and Ukrainians were FPV droning and bombing the Russian forces inside of this part of the village. And this is 100% geolocation, confirming the Russian control and the Russian presence in this town. So once again, the presence and geolocation of Russians in this area doesn't mean that the entire Bogdanovka is under complete Russian control. But some mappers have already updated their maps, showing that the central and the let's say eastern and the northeastern part of the village is already under the Russians. But if you ask my opinion, I believe that the Russians managed to enter Bogdanovka but to the southwestern part, and now they try to develop their foothold exactly on this direction. So how did that happen? I'll remind you that if you remember, just a few days ago we were talking about significant Russian attack from Kromova through the new cemetery, through the new Popovo forest, with significant number of Russian armored vehicles. And if you remember, at this point the Russian convoy was split in two parts. One personal carrier moved further to the eastern direction, to the western direction of Chasov Yar, and the Russian soldiers landed in the area and captured a foothold. Other Russian group continue moving further back to, let's say, to the west, north and northeast, and somewhere here we let's say lost the Russian convoy. But after that operation, after that offensive, a lot of mappers updated their maps, showing that the Russians managed to establish complete control over this part of the forest, and the Russians managed to establish complete control over the railways. So, and as I understand, after the Russians captured these forests, they crossed these fields and enter with the first assault troopers Bogdanovka itself. And of course, this is not the entire Bogdanovka, but just one part, but this is one of the most important part, because from this area the Russians managed to split the defense belt of the armed forces of Ukraine into two parts, Kalinovka and the hills, and the central part of Bogdanovka itself. Very likely the Ukrainians will not risk, and they will start abandoning their positions towards the hill, and with the purpose to serve the personnel and not to risk with the lives of Ukrainian soldiers. Very likely during the next few days the entire Bogdanovka, the central part, will be captured by the Russians. And those were not the only updates about the territory. The sources reported that the Russians, when they entered Bogdanovka, few squads, few groups started moving further to the western direction of Kalinovka, and the sources reported that the Russians also managed to establish a small foothold in Kalinovka itself. About this progress we haven't received even a single geolocated video, but the talks and rumors are like this. Furthermore, the Russians managed to improve their positions in direction of the village by the name of Grigorovka. After very powerful artillery preparation along the trenches, the Russians launched an offensive, and as a result of offensive, the Russians managed to establish control over these strongholds, trenches and the shelters along the line. And according to some sources, the Russians reached the outskirts, the eastern outskirts of Grigorovka itself. So currently this is the line line of combat contact that split Ukrainians and the Russians on the direction. And we understand that the main purpose of that attack was to, let's say, capture the stronghold, and now the Russians have possibilities to attack the main Ukrainian defense belt on Bogdanovka-Kalinovka direction, and we're talking about this forest. This is the heart of Bogdanovka defense. If the Russians are able to capture this forest, then everything will fall on almost until the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal that located to the west of the hill. So the situation, as you can see, is getting worse and worse for the Ukrainians. When talking about Ivanovska itself, different mappers, reliable mappers, continue updating their maps, showing additional Russian progress, and by different but reliable mappers, the Russians have already established control over this part of the forest to the west of Ivanovska, to the west and northwest of Ivanovska. Obviously significant results, significant progress. The Ukrainians are getting, let's say, closer and closer to the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass, and if we calculate the distance between Canal and Ukrainian positions themselves, we see that the distance and the foothold is very short. For example, in Chasov Yar, the Ukrainians control just 1 kilometer. Let's say in the forest Stupki-Golubkovsky, the Ukrainians control less than let's say 1.5 kilometers. To the west of Ivanovska, the Ukrainians controls just almost less than 1 kilometer. So it's nothing. It's nothing. You don't have, let's say, operational space. You don't have space for maneuvers. The only thing you have is some space to keep a very small army that is not able to stop any Russian push, any Russian offensive. And furthermore, the Russians, I'll remind you, have already entered the hills area, and now the Russians are on the same level with the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians lost the benefits of even in defense. And now we are moving to Klishchiivka. Also, the battle for Klishchiivka is about to be finished. Today the Russians published the video of how their drone was flying above the area, and the drone was dropping some applications, some lists, some papers, some documents suggesting the Ukrainians to surrender and to stop resistance. That those Ukrainians who are blocked already in Klishchiivka itself. So this is the situation on the direction. Very likely the next few days are going to be very hot for the Ukrainians and the Russians on this area. Now we are moving to Avdiivka area, probably the most important and the most interesting territory since the beginning probably of April, and the most important updates are coming from the line between Novokalinova, Keramik and Очеретина. If you remember, just yesterday we discussed that the Russians managed somehow, for now we don't know for sure, and it's still unclear how the Russians managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt and to capture the farms. The only thing we have is the video from some Ukrainian sources of how they were FPV droning the Russian forces inside of the farms. They were bombing and attacking, and also this video reported that the Ukrainians were bombing and attacking the Russians who established control over the farms. So we have adjusted the map, but if you remember, we had some doubts whether the Russians captured the farms, let's say a few days ago or yesterday, or maybe the Russians captured a long time ago, but just now the Ukrainians start clearing the area. So we had a lot of questions, and today on the 8th of April we got the final confirmation of Russian control over the territory, and we have had additional videos from the armed forces of Ukraine of their attempts to counterattack the Russians. For example, on this video we can see some fab explosions further to the west from the area, somewhere here. There were FABs explosions, and the Ukrainians were bombing the Russians here, as you can see. Then we have some, let's say, cluster rounds, cluster attacks, cluster bombings in this area from the Ukrainian side. And if we turn back to this video, just pay your attention to the shape of this forest. This is the forest. So this video was geolocated for 100%. This video confirms that these positions were under Russian control, and these positions were under heavy fire with Ukrainian cluster rounds. And once again, on the horizon of the same area, let's move back. As you can see on the horizon, two FABs arrived. Maybe not FABs, maybe Ukrainian HIMARS systems, and the explosions took place here in this area. So it's very difficult to understand whether the Russians were bombing this area with FABs or the Ukrainians were counterattacking the Russians with, let's say, HIMARS. Very difficult to understand. But after the Ukrainians bombed the area heavily, in the final part of the video, we can see the Ukrainian attempt to counterattack the Russian positions with Bradley and with infantry on board. This is Bradley arrived in the area. Then we can see the landing operation. The Ukrainians landed, let's say, a squad, 10 Ukrainian soldiers who started or made some attempts to clear the area. Currently, it's unknown whether the Ukrainians managed to achieve something or not. If we return back to the map, we can say that the Ukrainians were bombing this part, and then they sent Bradley along this line, along Pershatravneva Street. They reached this intersection of the street and the tree line, and then the Bradley turned to the south. The Bradley arrived in this area, then the infantry landed in this area, and the Ukrainians tried to clear the territory. So once again, the Bradleys came here. Then the Ukrainians landed the infantry. Bradley probably returned back to Keramik Novokalinova, and then there was very heavy clashes. For now, it's unknown whether the Ukrainians managed to restore control or not. Anyway, once again, on this area there were very heavy explosions. Russian probably FAB strikes. The Russians were clearing the territory for further offensive. And if we summarize everything, all these updates, we can make a conclusion based on the FABs to the north, based on the Russian significant progress to the east and southeast of Novokalinova, that the main Russian goal and the main Russian objective was to establish control over this part of the territory. For now, we can't tell for sure where exactly the Russians were stopped by the Ukrainians, but obviously this is significant and very interesting plans of the armed forces of Russian Federation. Furthermore, the Russians have already established significant control and achieved significant progress. And if we summarize everything once again, and if we, let's say, assume the Russians are able to reach this part of the foothold, then we see that Ukrainians that's located in the area between Novokalinova, Keramik and Ocheretina will appear in operational encirclement. Just to remind you, if we increase the numbers since the beginning of March, you're going to see that during the previous days, during the March, there were lots of FABs, lots of strikes, a lot of explosions on the southern flank of this, let's say, operation. So very likely, based on all these geolocations and based on this information, we can make a conclusion that the next few days we should expect another Russian attempt to attack in direction of this village from two directions along the railways. And if the Russians are able to establish control over this part of the foothold, so basically to improve their positions, let's say on the southern part of Novokeramik, let's say Novokalinova Keramik fortification, this is going to be obviously the operational encirclement that can lead to significant collapse of Ukrainian defense belt and to unpredictable consequences for the Ukrainians. Once again, something big and very unexpected happened on the, let's say, eastern and the northeastern and the southeastern flank of Novokalinova. Either the Ukrainians didn't expect the Russian attack, or maybe the Russians conducted another secret pipeline operation. They managed to, let's say, create another pipeline below the Ukrainians and to land it somewhere behind the Ukrainians. Currently, I can't tell you for sure. But the thing that we see that Ukrainians didn't expect Russian attack. Now we see that the situation develops very fast. Just yesterday the Russians were in the farms, and now we see a certain Russian activity much further to the west on this direction. So, and we see that Ukrainians are sending significant number of forces trying to slow down the Russians, and I can't tell you, let's say, whether the Ukrainians are very successful or not. Everything tells that Ukrainians are suffering losses and they may be defeated on this direction as well. And we understand the main Russian goal to encircle and establish operational encirclement of Keramik Novokalinova, and if the Russians are able to do this, this is like the open window of opportunity for the Russians to move further to the north in direction of Konstantinovka from behind, and also in direction of Konstantinovka from behind. This is the first possible direction, and of course in direction of Toretsk, New York, with the purpose to encircle this agglomeration. And I'll remind you that currently we see a very big Russian activity activity on the line Azaryanovka, Kurdyumovka, Zelenopolye. And if the Russians start offensive operation on this direction as well, then we can make a conclusion that the Russians try to encircle the Ukrainians in New York, Toretsk and Dzerzhinsk. I'll remind you, let's increase the numbers of updates since the beginning even of April. We see significant number of Russian artillery strikes, FPV activity, so something big is going to happen, obviously. And the one thing I know for sure, the Ukrainians don't have even a single idea where exactly the Russians are planning to attack. They're trying to reinforce and to improve the defense built in Odessa, Kharkiv, but now, based on geolocations, we see that the Russians are attacking in completely opposite and different position. Now we are moving to the south in direction of Novomikhailivka. We have some updates, additional Russian progress, let's say to the north, to the north of the central part. As a result of offensive, the Russians managed to improve their positions a little bit, but still Novomikhailivka, the western part of Novomikhailivka, under the Ukrainians. We have certain activity of the Russians in Ugledar, few more FPV drone strikes. The preparation operation continues. Very likely, due to the concentration of Russian fire, there are going to be more attempts from the Russian side to attack. Vremivka tactical bridge had few more FABs arrived in the area, few more additional artillery strikes, few more aviation strikes on this direction. So very likely that after this pummeling, the Russians will make another attempt to attack. Zaporozhye, nothing special. Kherson, we have already discussed. And probably that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.